A real crime. In a series of podcasts, I want you to travel down some lonely roads with me. These are the roads I traveled with families who never got to say goodbye to loved ones. These family members were fated to live the rest of their lives waiting and wondering. I will begin this series with unsolved murders, but I will also revisit cases that include arrests because aspects of the case are worth re-examining. I wrote these stories when I worked as a reporter for the Charleston Gazette. Thanks for listening today. I'm delving into domestic violence again. This story illustrates how continued abuse can have many unimagined consequences. Episode 19, Wrong River. If we were staging this like a movie, in the opening scene, a camera would show a grandmother quietly stepping inside the kitchen. She lived next door and heard dangerous shouting coming from her daughter's house. She sees her son-in-law holding a .22 rifle, pointing it at her daughter and her grandchildren. His back is to her. He has not heard her enter the kitchen. With ease, she walked closer to him and pulled the rifle away from him. Rejoice! The camera cuts to a celebration, and Grandma is the hero. Everyone is saved. But this sad tale does not unfold as any director might want, and not for 1 second could the unfolding story be considered premeditated. In several interviews, Cleo Duncan told me about the physical and emotional abuse she suffered at the hands of her husband. Much of what she endured defies objective reality. For example, he once threw her off the high porch at their house. This broke both of her feet. Another time, after a prolonged beating, she awoke in the bathroom. As she came to, she kept trying to brush something away from her face. She soon realized the object was her eyeball. In the beating, her husband had dislodged her eye. She said she managed to look at herself in the mirror, and she told me she looked like someone had thrown a bucket of blood over her. Her husband put her in the shower and took her to a hospital. Going to a hospital became problematic. She always had to give excuses for her injuries to the people who examined her. A nurse asked, "Weren't you here about a month ago with facial injuries?" "Yes." A broken nose, broken teeth, a miscarriage after her husband slammed her against a wall when she was 4 months pregnant. She told one doctor she fell down a flight of stairs. The doctor said, "Why do you have only head injuries?" She endured and hoped for the best. She had 3 sons by a previous marriage and 1 daughter with James Duncan. On the last night of Duncan's life, he came in drunk. He was mad because the wood stove had gone out, and he demanded his supper. He got mad at Cleo's sons for letting the fire go out, and he got mad at her for the supper. He threw the plate of food on the wall and threatened her. Cleo fled outside of her house as her husband chased her and brought her back inside. The noise awakened the children. Her oldest son stepped out of his room and told Duncan never to shake his mother again. Cleo told me she knew instantly that her sons were in trouble. They had never said anything to Duncan before. Everything exploded, she remembered. He got a .22 rifle and started threatening the boys. He chased them in and outside the house where they lived in remote Highland Mountain. He picked up his baby daughter and held her with one arm and the gun with the other. At one point, he had Cleo and all of her children in the kitchen. He took turns pointing the rifle at each of them. He did not point the rifle at his daughter, but in his threats, he said he would kill everyone. At that moment, Dorothy Grubb managed to enter the kitchen through the back door. She slipped the rifle out of Duncan's hand. Cleo told me later she felt such a relief at that moment. It's going to be okay, she thought, now that her mother had the gun. But Duncan turned around and walked toward his mother-in-law. She shot him dead. Cleo also told me later that so many thoughts went screaming around her head. First she thought, my mother is in trouble and it's my fault. Then she thought of Duncan's mother. She said she could not imagine having to tell her, my mother killed your son. When someone is lying there dead, you don't think, Cleo told me later. The family thought first of burying Duncan. Grubb asked 2 of her grandsons to dig a grave in ground near their house. Later, Cleo told me, she was consumed with the idea that she was denying her husband a decent burial. They started planning their next steps. As you and I sit comfortably and contemplate their situation, we say to ourselves, I would never do what they did. Cleo told me that panic controlled all of their thinking. They contrived an idea that they would make Duncan's death look like a vehicular accident. But Mrs. Grubb knew police would find the bullet she fired into her son-in-law. 2 of Cleo's sons dug up their 35-year-old stepfather. Mrs. Grubb carved into him to try to extract the bullet. She cut out his heart and lungs, but never found the bullet. In one bit of detail that always struck me when I covered this case, Duncan was wearing a T-shirt that read, "Dirty, Mean, and Nasty." One of Cleo's sons drove his stepfather's truck to the area of Prince, West Virginia, and edged the truck into the New River. They planned to report Duncan missing to police. Cleo wanted his body found and wanted his family to have a chance to give him a proper burial. In the next part of the plan, they would dump his body into the river. With clear evidence that his chest cavity was carved into, they hoped that after some time in the river, police might think fish, animals, and the water itself might explain the conditions of his body. Mother, daughter, and 1 grandson headed for Wigan Bridge near Hinton. They planned to throw his body into the river. After Duncan was pushed out of the car, one of his feet became entangled in the bridge's superstructure. With his foot trapped in the bridge, his body was hanging over the river. In the dark, one of Cleo's sons got out of the car and climbed under the bridge. He was trying to untangle Duncan's foot when each member of the party noticed headlights coming toward them. These lights were from a Hinton police cruiser. In a panic, Cleo drove off, leaving her son under the bridge. Earlier, family members drove Duncan's truck into the New River in Fayette County, but they attempted to drop his body into the Greenbrier River in Summers County. If, as they hoped, they could make Duncan's death look like a vehicular accident, they chose the wrong river for the attempted body dump. They hoped his body would float toward his truck. Needless to say, arrests and court actions followed. Originally, family members were charged with murder and taken to Fayette County Magistrates Court. After hearing evidence, the late Tom Aleo ruled there was no probable cause for murder charges. His decision shocked many people, but he explained that all the bizarre events happened after Duncan was shot. He believed Mrs. Grubb acted in self-defense. She had seen her son-in-law threaten her family. She disarmed him. But once he stepped toward her, Aleo believed she acted in self-defense. The elements for a murder charge must include malice and premeditation. Although she did not shoot her husband or dig him up, Cleo Duncan faced a murder charge and unlawful disinterment of a corpse. In time, Mrs. Grubb entered a guilty plea to voluntary manslaughter and to digging up a dead body. Cleo went to trial in Fayette County Circuit Court on 2 charges, murder and unlawful disinterment. She was found not guilty of murder, but she went to jail at the Women's Federal Prison in Alderson for unlawful disinterment. Most people familiar with this case said from the beginning that if the family had called police immediately after Duncan was shot, they do not believe any charges would have been filed. Cleo Duncan told me that the years of abuse she suffered made her feel worthless. She never considered filing any battery charges against her husband. But as everyone realizes, the assaults domestic violence victims suffer would clearly be considered crimes if the same kind of abuse was inflicted on someone outside the home. Too often, domestic violence is brushed off as a private matter, but this case and many more illustrate how deadly it can be. This episode is dedicated to the memory of Charleston Gazette editor Charles Riley. Thanks to you for listening and to Tommy Signer for his always great work. Please join me next Wednesday for another episode of A Real Crime by Susan Williams.